our capacity to adapt to climate change is complex because it relies on a whole range of different dimensions, right? We don't only talk about what kind of technologies we have available to us, but we also talk about what democracies we have, what economies we rely on, or the range of institutions we have to help us make decisions as a society, right? So it is complex because it relies on the intersection of all these different dimensions to actually produce a society that is resilient and adaptive to climate change. So an example can be from some of the field work I've done in Madagascar, where we see that the populations that are the most adaptive to climate change are not those that have specific technologies available to them, but it's those that have diversified economies, that have strong relationships with their neighbors or the neighboring city, because that's what adaptation means. It's relying on a diversity of systems to weather a shock and better respond to it.
I think that links really well to kind of how we think about kind of climate adaptation in Bergen. We often ask ourselves kind of what kind of city and what kind of society will kind of meet climate change as it kind of strikes us. And in that regard, like what will kind of influence how we're impacted by climate change is kind of the type of infrastructure we build, the types of buildings we construct, but also kind of the social fabric, which social groups are vulnerable, kind of economic relations and so forth. And all of these things will kind of affect our impact. So actually the development of climate change and climate hazards is just a very small piece of a much larger issue that also includes kind of how our populations are vulnerable, how populations are differently exposed to climate change, and how climate change increasingly acts as kind of a risk amplifier, amplifying these other societal issues that we are dealing with as a city. So I think one of the things that makes our work really complex is that there's no one part of the municipality that can solve this problem alone. We really need to bring lots of different departments and actors together. So when we work on climate adaptation in Bergen, for example, through a network kind of combined on physical climate risk, where we kind of bring together people from across the municipality to kind of mobilize work on climate adaptation. We need to include people from the water authority, from the construction sector, from the roads authorities and so forth. And all of these people play a very important role. And we need to align that work. But that's also just a small piece of a broader picture, because another part is kind of the whole kind of community and society of Bergen that also needs to be involved. So when we work on kind of measures against sea level rise, I think one of the huge issues we're facing is kind of who is responsible for kind of protecting properties against these impacts. Is it the insurance companies? Is it local businesses? Is it the homeowners? Is it the municipality? These are all kind of issues that we need to clarify and work towards kind of finding common solutions.
So an important way of understanding the types of risk that climate change will create for us as a society is to understand risk as a product of three things. One is the types of hazards that we will be impacted by. So more rain, more winds, cyclones if you live in the tropics. It's a product of the type of exposure that you're subjected to. So if you live on the coast, you might be subjected to specific hazards, unlike if you live in the mountains. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, it has to do or is a product of vulnerability. So the more vulnerable you are, the more likely you are as a community to be holding the burden of risk. So that means that the more marginal groups in society, whether you have low income, you're part of the elderly, or you're politically misrepresented, those communities actually hold the burden. And it's a disproportionate burden of risk in a society. So what does that mean in practice? Well, in practice it means we need to have more equity-based adaptation to protect the most vulnerable from climate change, which means including them into decision processes, making their voice heard into how we take decisions as a community.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things we try to do in Bergen is to kind of work towards creating more community ownership of climate change adaptation. I think in Norway, we have this culture where we expect the insurance companies and the authorities to save us when the disaster strikes, right? And one of the things we're working on now is to basically, when we expect heavy rain, for example, we send out public service announcements advising local neighborhoods and homeowners to kind of secure their own property, to make sure that their basements are not being flooded, but also to clean their gutters and to make sure that the stormwater drains are open, so they will open up the waterways. And I think that's one small thing that makes actually climate change and heavy rain something that we can actually do something about at an individual household level. I would say as municipalities we have a very broad range of responsibilities, right? So we have to make difficult priorities all the time. And I think that the political discussion about these priorities is part of a healthy society, part of a healthy discussion about what type of city do we want to build and live in the future. I think what we can do as a municipality in the technical administration is to work seriously with stakeholder engagement, to make sure that different groups in society and different neighborhoods are heard and get a voice as we kind of prioritize different types of adaptation measures.
Mm. And I think we should also be mindful of the fact that if you look at the political offer today, climate is prioritized quite differently along this political spectrum, right? If you go from the right to the left, the center, climate will appear very differently in the different party programs, and that's important to be aware of. A second element, when we think of the politics around climate change and climate adaptation, they don't only happen within the close political circles of local assembly, for example. So the politics also happen in the streets, and we see over the last 10 years, for example, a diversity of NGOs, organizations, just blooming all over Bergen that are focusing specifically on climate change or addressing aspects of climate change. And these are also politics. These are part of how we talk about climate change, think of climate change, and act for it.
As a city, Bergen is defined by the ocean, by mountains, and I would say by rain. And I think what we're facing now and what we'll face more of in the future is kind of more and more intense rainfall. We'll face sea level rise in the longer term, but we'll also kind of experience more intense heat waves and probably periods of drought as well. And some of the work we do kind of collectively in the municipality now, we're working a lot on kind of mapping what kind of climate hazards are we kind of facing in the future. So we're working on cloudburst plans. Where will the water actually go when we get really, really heavy rain? We're working on assessments of sea level rise measures and which areas that will be kind of hit by sea level rise. We are doing a lot of work kind of mapping which areas in the city are kind of exposed to other types of natural hazards such as landslides that will also kind of be triggered by climate change and by kind of more heavy precipitation. And we're trying to bring all of this together into kind of a comprehensive climate risk assessment. The purpose of doing all of this knowledge mapping work is to a large extent, being able to kind of integrate climate adaptation and climate resilience measures into our daily operations and our daily maintenance of our roads and our water systems and so forth. So we can actually make this quite cost effective. When we are upgrading a road, we can kind of add some kind of climate adaptation on top of that, instead of building kind of completely new measures to protect that. Another thing we're working on quite a lot, as we are cities defined by water and rain, is that we are kind of working towards upgrading our stormwater system. We're kind of opening up waterways, and we're trying to kind of integrate more types of kind of nature-based solutions in order to create areas that will kind of delay heavy water flows.
Mm-hmm. From a research perspective, the scientific community is also heavily involved in climate adaptation here in Bergen. So we have a number of centers all working on climate change research, especially on climate change adaptation research. So what does that community do? It's new knowledge on exposure, on vulnerability maps, on long-term forecasts and the types of impacts that we might have here in Bergen. So there is also a strong relationship between the scientific community and the municipality here in Bergen. But we have to be cognizant that these are all locally based researchers and research, but they also feed into a better global understanding of climate change adaptation and climate change impacts. So that's very important.